The moment I stood there, ankle deep in the wreckage of an $80,000 home theater, watching 30,000 gallons of mountain runoff cascade through a designer's ceiling like a biblical plague, I realized that karma doesn't just ring the doorbell. She kicks it down and brings a flood with her. There was this surreal, metallic tang in the air, a mix of pulverized drywall and expensive Italian leather, soaking in muddy creek water, and as I watched Delilah Vance shrieking at the top of her lungs while her husband's winner one, vanity plates probably floated somewhere in the garage, I didn't oppose. Feel a shred of guilt. I'm Wyatt Miller, and 6 months ago, I was just a guy trying to find some peace in the wake of a brutal divorce by moving back to the only place that ever felt like home. My grandfather's 3-acre sanctuary in the shadow of the Rockies, a place defined by a crystal-clear creek that had been the heartbeat of our family for 4 generations. That creek wasn't in Oppos. Just some landscape feature to us. It was a living history book where my grandfather, Silas, taught me how to read the ripples of the water to find the trout hiding under the cut banks, and where I now watch my own kids, Leo and Maya, rediscover the simple magic of building stone dams and catching salamanders after months of being stuck in a cramped suburban apartment. It was legally bulletproof too, protected by senior water rights dating back to 1948, which meant that in the eyes of Colorado law, my water was there long before the concrete jungle of the Pinecrest Estates was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. But then came Delilah, a woman who moved here from a gated community in Scottsdale with enough, new money, to buy the biggest McMansion on the ridge and enough misplaced entitlement to think she had been appointed the empress of the wilderness. Delilah was the kind of person who wore 4-inch designer heels to a neighborhood barbecue and looked at a natural ecosystem like it was a dirty carpet that needed to be vacuumed, and within 6 months, she maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency with a campaign built on, standardization, and, visual harmony, She had this terrifying, surgical talent for finding anyone who didn't oppose. Fit her vision of a manicured step-forward paradise and grinding them down with fines and violations until they either surrendered or sold their souls just to get her off their porch. I saw her go after Mrs. Nguyen, a tiny grandmother who'd been growing heirloom herbs for the local kitchen since the 80s, forcing her to rip out, non-approved foliage, while Mrs. Nguyen cried on her knees in the dirt, and I saw her harass a young father, Caleb, whose wife was going through stage 4 treatments because his lawn was 3 inches too long during a week they were at the hospital. The war for my creek officially started when I received a certified letter that basically called my family's heritage a, stagnant health hazard, and a, breeding ground for disease, demanding I fill it in and divert the flow into the municipal storm drain within 30 days or face a $500 daily fine. I remember walking up to her massive, sterile front door with a folder full of my grandfather's original water deeds and my own credentials as a senior hydraulic engineer, literally the guy the city calls to fix their water problems, thinking we could just have a rational conversation between adults. I'll never forget the way she looked at me, peering over her designer glasses with this look of pure, concentrated condescension, telling me that, tradition is just a fancy word for lack of progress, and that her board had already voted to remediate the, hazard, She didn't oppose to even look at the papers. She just crunched her heels onto my gravel driveway and told me she'd see me in court or at the foreclosure auction, whichever came first. What Delilah didn't oppose, understand, and what people like her never seem to grasp, is that water ISN and oppose. Like a neighbor you can bully or a fine you can ignore, it's a force of physics that has been carving its path through the earth for 10,000 years. And if you try to block it with nothing but ego and a little bit of concrete, it's going to find the path of least resistance, and usually, that path goes right through your foundation. As the weeks went by, she turned the neighborhood into a police state, parking her white Escalade at the end of my drive to record my kids playing in the water, and even calling my firm Miller and Damp Associates, trying to claim I was, unstable, and, endangering the community, She was trying to bankrupt my soul, but she didn't oppose. Realized she was picking a fight with someone who understood the weight of every gallon of water pushing against the soil. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when I organized a secret meeting at a local diner, and 22 families showed up, all of them nursing their own scars from Delilah's reign of terror. And as we sat there over lukewarm coffee, the story started pouring out like a dam breaking. Mrs. Nguyen told us how Delilah had threatened to call ICE on her even though she'd been a citizen for 40 years, and Caleb admitted he'd spent his wife's medical savings just to repaint his house and, quote, regulation beige, and, quote, to stop the daily fines. It was a protection racket disguised as community management, and that's when my engineering brain kicked into overdrive, because I realized Delilah wasn't Oppos. T just being a bully. She was hiding something big. I started digging into the county's digital permit archives, stayed up until 3 in the morning cross-referencing topographic maps with the HOA's financial audits, and that's when I found the smoking gun that would eventually lead to her basement becoming an aquarium. It turns out that 2 years ago, when Delilah and her husband, Vance, were building their, quote, underground oasis, quote, theater, they ran into a massive groundwater issue. The same mountain runoff that fed my creek was pushing right against their plot, and instead of doing the expensive, legal thing and installing a proper drainage field, they paid a cut-rate contractor to, quote, redirect, quote, the water. They basically built an illegal underground concrete wall, a subterranean dam that was forcing the water away from their house and directly toward the lower properties, which was exactly why my creek had started getting murky and why the neighbors' yards were suddenly turning into swamps. She was blaming me for a, quote, water hazard, quote, that she had literally created with her own illegal construction, and the irony of it was so thick I could practically taste it. But Delilah wasn't Oppos. T done playing dirty. And on a Friday evening while I was supposed to be at a conference in Denver, I got a frantic text from Caleb saying there was a heavy-duty cement mixer idling in front of my property. I drove back like a man possessed, doing 80 on the back roads, and when I pulled in my driveway, I saw the headlights of the truck illuminating the very spot where my grandfather had taught me to fish, with Delilah standing there in a high-vis vest like she was the general of some suburban army, screaming at a confused foreman to, quote, just pour the damn sludge and fill the hole, end quote. I stepped out of my truck, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't Oppos. Angry. I was calm, because I had a sheriff's deputy on my speakerphone and a federal environmental officer already 5 minutes away. I walked right up to the foreman, a guy named Mike who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and I handed him a single sheet of paper. It wasn't an Oppos. The water rights this time. It was a copy of the federal, quote, endangered species protection, quote, order for the greenback cutthroat trout, a species that I had documented spawning in my creek just 3 days prior with the help of a local biologist. I told him, quote, Mike, if you drop a single ounce of concrete into that water, you're not just looking at a fine, you're looking at a felony environmental crime with a mandatory prison sentence, and your company will be blacklisted by the EPA before the sun comes up, end quote. Mike took one look at the paper, looked at the deputy pulling into the drive, and shut off the engine right in the middle of Delilah's mid-sentence scream. And the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I've ever heard. The fallout was spectacular, but the real, quote, chef's kiss, quote, moment happened 3 weeks later during a record-breaking rainstorm that hammered the Rockies for 48 hours straight. Because Delilah had tried to mess with the natural flow, and because she'd spent her, quote, remediation, quote, budget on lawyers instead of actually fixing her illegal underground dam. The hydrostatic pressure built up behind her house like a ticking time bomb. Nature doesn't Oppos. Care about your HOA bylaws or your expensive home theater. It only cares about gravity and pressure, and at 3 a.m., the ground beneath her McMansion couldn't Oppos. Hold back the mountain anymore. The illegal concrete barrier she'd built finally gave way, and all that diverted water, the water she tried to steal from my creek, decided it wanted to go home, and the shortest path home was right through her basement walls. I woke up the next morning to the sound of sirens and saw the water receding from my creek, flowing clear and strong again for the first time in months, while a fleet of industrial pump trucks were lined up in front of Delilah's house. When I walked over there, ostensibly to, quote, offer help, quote, but mostly to witness the scale of the justice, I saw the horror on her face as the insurance adjuster told her, in no uncertain terms, that because the basement renovation was unpermitted and the drainage was illegal, they wouldn't end oppos to be paying a single cent for the ruined theater or the structural damage. She was standing there, her designer lifestyle literally sinking into the mud, while the neighbors she'd bullied for years just stood on their porches and watched in silence. And for a moment, our eyes met, and she knew that the, in quote, dirty creek, in quote, had won. In the end, Delilah didn't end oppos. T just lose her theater. She lost the presidency, she lost her reputation, and after the HOA audit I triggered revealed she'd been, in quote, borrowing, in quote, funds to pay for her personal legal fees. She and Vance had to sell the McMansion just to stay out of jail. The new board is run by Caleb and Mrs. and Gwen. The creek is now a protected sanctuary where kids from 3 different counties come learn about trout. And every time it rains, I sit on my porch with a beer and listen to the water babbling over the stones, remembering that you could try to pave over the truth, you could try to bury it in concrete. But eventually, the truth, just like the water, is going to find its way out. But it makes me wonder, because I see this happening everywhere now, these little pockets of power-hungry people trying to dictate how we live on our own land, using rules like weapons to strip away the character of our communities. Was it just about the water for her? Or was it the need to control something she couldn't and oppos? Do you understand? And if you were in my shoes, watching your family's history being threatened by a woman with a clipboard and a vendetta, would you have waited for the flood, or would you have poured the concrete yourself just to end the stress? I'd love to hear if you've ever had a, in quote, Delilah, in quote, in your life, someone who thought they were above the law until nature proved them wrong. Drop a comment below. And let's talk about whether justice is better served in a courtroom or in a flooded basement.